Hi, everyone. Welcome to the update for Project Rise from this past year. I just want to give you a quick overview of what you're going to see in today's video. Hillary Bergsieker is going to start us off with a recap and update on Project Rise 1.0 and 2.0. These are our workshop studies on fostering an inclusive culture through bias education and allyship. Then we're going to have a series of 4 short teasers about some other projects going on related to Project Rise. Rebecca Anderson at Brock University will talk about whether an inclusive culture can predict men's allyship norms and women's workplace outcomes. And Kristen Nader will talk about the benefits of inclusive cultures for reducing dominant styles of leadership and social interaction in groups. Then we'll have a pair of short teasers on perceiving implicit bias. Carmel Barakat-Shavit will talk about whether people accurately estimate how painful implicit bias can be. And Hillary Bergsieker will wrap us up talking about a paper on whether an inclusion frame can increase people's perceptions of gender bias. Enjoy the talks.
Thanks very much for joining us today. It's my pleasure to share the latest RISE analysis results from our long-running research project with workshops. This is a project, just to refresh your memory, in which we randomly assigned almost 300 STEM professionals to participate in a 5-part half-day workshop on either inclusive innovation or influential leadership in partnership with the Winset Center. We then assessed workshop impacts over time and sent reports to our partners earlier this year to get a sense of how these 2 different workshops compared and their impact on individuals. In terms of who was in our sample, we had a pretty even representation of men and women, comparably distributed across the 2 workshop conditions. We also see a wide variety of racial and ethnic backgrounds represented, although white participants do make up the majority of our sample. We see about 2/3 engineers and 1/3 scientists in terms of people's primary self-identifications, with a diversity of languages and sexual orientations also included. In terms of recapping some of the findings we've shared with you in past years, just as a quick refresher, participants reported enjoying both workshops and rated them both very positively. We did see some specific, though, impacts that varied across the 2 workshops. So the inclusion workshop specifically was associated with greater accuracy in recognizing subtle gender bias in some test scenarios that we gave participants, as well as with higher motivation to act as an ally to women in STEM and greater self-efficacy or sense of knowing how to do so. The leadership workshop, in contrast, was associated with improved accuracy in recognizing distinct leadership styles in test scenarios, as well as seeing leadership as a skill rather than some sort of innate trait. With regard to gender stereotypes, we also see some neat data or patterns coming out of our reaction time data. So this was looking at how readily people are able to associate male versus female names with concepts related to science and engineering. And here, higher scores on the y-axis are going to indicate a stronger STEM equals male bias. And what we see is in the sample as a whole, there is a significant association between STEM and male. However, this association emerges primarily among men, not among women in our sample. And accordingly, it's then interesting that it's specifically for the men who have more of this implicit bias to begin with, where we see increased recognition of their own gender bias after participating in the inclusion training rather than the leadership training, whereas women sort of start out already very high in that awareness and don't change. We also were wondering whether there might be any kind of backlash or resistance where people who don't think gender is bias is a problem react negatively to the contents of the inclusion workshop. We haven't seen that pattern, and instead we've seen basically the opposite. So essentially, when we ask people about the extent to which they believe gender bias is a problem in STEM fields, they indicate that a variety of levels of beliefs at baseline, and we've now sort of stratified our data based on whether people were lower or higher on those initial beliefs that bias is a problem. And notably, this was done continuously, even though I'm presenting these as if they were 2 discrete groups of participants. These analyses are also continuous. What we see at all the different time points is a significant interaction where workshop effects on belief that bias is a problem depend on your starting position. So people who are initially skeptical are the ones that see the biggest gains in terms of recognizing that gender bias is an issue after the inclusion training versus the leadership training. So again, this suggests that the inclusion workshop is reaching the folks who are initially skeptical that bias is relevant or problematic in their field. Turning to actions, I'll remind you that we did see in the short term that it was women in particular who reported in engaging in more sort of general allyship to other women in STEM after the inclusion versus the leadership workshop, whereas for men, we saw no workshop related effects. However, interestingly, when we zoom in on the specific allyship action plans that participants generated and refined in our workshops, we see a changing pattern over time. So whereas a few weeks or a few months after the workshop, women were much more likely to report having enacted these plans, that gender gap disappears by 18 to 20 months later. And in fact, as a robustness check, when we look at this as a repeated measures analysis, so analyzing only the participants who had complete data across all 3 time points, we see no significant change over time for the women, whereas we see a significant increase in action plan enactment amongst the men specifically. Turning finally to fit and engagement, we see some encouraging evidence that participating in the inclusion workshop versus the leadership workshop is associated with greater fit and engagement in the final time point of our survey. So here, an analysis, all of which control for baseline levels of these different outcomes, we see that participants in the inclusion condition report higher levels of fit than those in leadership. Fit is feeling respected by your colleagues, as though your values and goals are a fit to the work that you're doing, as well as higher engagement in that time point. And engagement here is feeling not burned out, not planning to search for a new job in the next 2 years, feeling more committed to your organization and so forth. And encouragingly, if anything, these patterns tend to be a bit stronger for women, suggesting that people who've historically been underrepresented or shut out may especially benefit from these kinds of trainings in terms of their sense of belonging in their organization. Finally, our current work focuses on a virtual version of the Inclusive Innovation Workshop done in pairs. We're pleased to report that we now have over 300 participants from over 15 different organizations. Thank you very much for those of you who helped support this work. We see a reasonable gender balance of men and women across the different sessions we've conducted, as well as we have some additional participants who are in a survey-only control condition. The design of the study is a waitlist control design where participants are assigned randomly either to complete an early workshop toward the beginning of their participation in the project or a late workshop near the end, allowing us to compare both people's attitudes and behaviors before versus after their own training, as well as to make comparisons between people who have already received the training and those who have not yet. So we are nearing the very end of this project, but we are still accepting new participants. So this is the last best chance to get involved if you haven't already. Please email us or visit our website for more information. And thank you again for your interest in and support for this research.
Hi, my name is Rebecca Anderson, and I'm a graduate student working with Will Hall at Brock University. Our research focuses on understanding the effect of institutional signals of inclusion, specifically gender-inclusive workplace policies, on perceptions of interpersonal norms and beliefs regarding what is possible for the self at work. Across 3 studies, we found that gender-inclusive workplace policies led to stronger perceptions of inclusive interpersonal norms and a greater belief that the work culture would make it possible to behave inclusively when interacting with others, express oneself authentically at work, and engage in behaviors that would help achieve professional goals. These findings provide evidence to support that gender-inclusive workplace policies can help signal an inclusive workplace culture and create expectations of a social environment that affords individuals the opportunity to engage in positive behaviors.
My name is Chris Donata, and I'd like to present you a project in which we examined dominant leadership behavior. For women, dominant leadership behavior can result in backlash because it's against the stereotype, whereas less dominant behavior is not a problem for women, and for men, dominant leadership behavior never results or doesn't result in backlash. So across an experiment and the field study with engineering students, we examined and also found, as hypothesized, that When the culture is more inclusive, everyone, women and men, reduce their use of dominance. And in the study on the right with the engineering students, we also see that when the group is more inclusive, particularly the men more equally share control over the technical task with others. So results show that yes, an inclusive culture allows women and also men to conform less to the masculine type standard of dominant leadership behavior.
Hi everyone, I'm Carmel. I'm a second-year master's student working with Tony, and we're currently working on a project that asks about the perceptions and actual experiences of harm from implicit and intentional forms of bias. Our work is informed by this recently published typology that takes a dual process view of bias as unfolding from an agent's motivation, awareness, and regulation. And often we've talked about bias as being either implicit or explicit. But by using this typology, we can represent 4 distinct ways bias plays out. We measured women's perceptions of harm from these distinct forms of gender bias. And when we collapse it across the major categories, we see that intentional forms of bias were perceived as more painful than implicit forms of bias. And then we followed it up by asking for third-party judgments of how others might expect a woman would respond to these forms of bias. And these groups follow the same pattern as women actually reported. And just as a preview of our work, this is the pattern of women's perceived pain when we look at the distinct forms of biased behavior. And here's the comparison to our third-party judgments. For the most part, there's a lot of similarity with what women perceived and what others anticipated women would feel. And there's some underestimation and overestimation of pain in 2 of the conditions. But we're developing the project more, and if you have any thoughts, I would love to connect. Thank you very much.
Can simply reminding people to focus on inclusion help activate their allyship intentions? To test this question, we randomly assigned participants to one of 3 framing conditions: an empty control, a condition in which they were asked to focus on leadership, or one in which they were asked to focus on inclusion. In a replication, we used an indirect method to frame the situation by merely asking them about their current workplace, whether it had policies and training opportunities related to leadership, to safety, or to inclusion, depending on their randomly assigned condition. Next, everybody watched a video depicting workplace sexism, and then finally, we asked people how they would react. We found that the inclusion framing condition relative to leadership framing increased participants' allyship intentions and their open-ended responses, their ability to detect gender bias, their desire to work with and their liking for the women in the scenario, and the probability of taking anti-bias reactions like reporting the behavior. So we see this evidence as encouraging that regular reminders to focus on inclusion can be valuable for helping activate people's allyship-oriented behaviors.